Hello, everyone. My name is Shara Evans, and I'm a technology futurist who is based in Sydney, Australia. It is my absolute delight today to be part of Microsoft's Envision Forum. And this is my first time speaking to a Romanian audience. I wish more than anything that I could be with you live and in person. In fact, as a futurist, if I think out a couple of hundred years from now, we might actually be able to teleport into an area together and then go back to our respective offices or homes. But that's a long way off. But believe it or not, already in the world of quantum physics, researchers are looking at quantum teleportation for particles. And this little vision I've painted for you, which seems very far in the distance for science fiction, might someday, in a few hundred years, become a reality. Today, what I'd like to do is actually share with you a whole bunch of ideas about where the world is likely to be going over the next 5, 10, 20 years and beyond, as well as talking about some of the things that are impacting us in the immediate term. So let me start with the one technology that I think is going to have the most profound impact on humanity on both an individual and a business basis, and that is artificial intelligence. And when I talk about AI, I'm using it as a big umbrella term. So I'm referring to techniques like deep learning and machine learning, but also things like natural language processing, things like speech to text, chatbots, facial recognition, image recognition, emotion detection, robots in their many, many different forms, including driverless cars, and a whole lot more. The AI that we're developing right now is becoming increasingly sophisticated, and the fuel that it uses is the big data that we as individuals and businesses are generating on an everyday basis. But moreover, if we combine this with advances that are happening in the world of quantum computing, where computers are getting faster and faster and faster, then the likelihood that AIs will get smarter and smarter on a near term basis is also something that we should be considering as we look at how AI is going to impact us on both a personal and a business basis. One of the areas where artificial intelligence is already being used in many different businesses is something called robotic process automation, or RPA. And essentially, anything that you can do with a keyboard and a mouse, and that's repetitive, can be automated and can be done by an AI. And this may include things like answering routine emails. It may be responding to social media or gathering social media statistics and analytics. It may even include, in the world of finance, doing general journal ledger entries or reconciling them. There's so much that's possible with this technology of RPA. But one thing that we really need to bear in mind is that the way that this technology is going to benefit us in the greatest way is by taking the boring, mundane, routine tasks out of someone's everyday job, letting that be automated, and then using our very valuable human capital who knows lots about our businesses to free up their time to do things that are much more valuable, like deal with complex customer situations. There are so many good uses, but we need to make sure that we're not looking at it as a replacement for human jobs. Another area Where artificial intelligence is already being used is in the sales and marketing area. So if you can imagine that you're in the retail business, you would probably know that the top 1% of your customers are 18 times more valuable than an average customer. So if you can use tools like AI to get messages to your customers at the right time, right place, right device, you're going to get a much better return on investment than if you just blindly put advertisements out there. So in this little illustration here, I'm showing an example of a dapper young man who just happens to be in a shopping mall and gets an ad for his favorite brand. And it happens to be on sale and they have his size. What do you think the chances are that he might actually venture into the store, which is just a short walk from where he is, and have a look at this particular item? Another really good example of using this technology is done by the Royal Bank of Scotland. And what they are doing is looking at customer overdrafts by using AI to look at patterns. And AI is great at looking at massive data sets. But it's not an AI who contacts a customer, it's actually a human finance expert who might call the customer and say, we've noticed that you have a pattern here, and here's what we can do to help you. That wins customer loyalty. Another example that I like of using AI in sales and marketing comes from a hotel chain called Dorchester, where they get thousands of reviews of their hotel brands. And what they're doing is using AI to distill all of these reviews into short 30-minute videos that are put to their board of directors and executives on a monthly basis, which summarizes the things that customers are saying about them. Now, when it comes to I had mentioned natural language processing, and that means voice recognition. And let me say, voice is the next big thing. Many of you would probably be talking to your smartphones through applications like Cortana or others, or maybe you have home automation devices. Well, there's a funny story that comes out of the UK of an African gray parrot called Rocco that has learned how to talk to its owner's digital assistant. And this particular type of bird is a fantastic mimic. It can mimic its owner's voice to a T, and it's learned how to place orders for its favorite treats. It can get the digital assistant to play music, and the two of them chatter back and forth all day long. Can you imagine what would happen if we had thousands of these smart parrots chatting with AIs all day long, how that might skew the information in an AI database? Well, if we go out a little bit into the future, these kinds of home appliances may be even more profound. There was a study done by the Imperial College in London a few years ago that was predicting that within 1 to 3 years that these kinds of digital devices would be looking and listening to the conversations that happen in a person's home and might actually interject with relationship advice. For instance, it might say, Shara, if you want to talk to a guy and get him to understand in guy language, you need to rephrase what you're saying in a different way, or vice versa. Well, that 1 to 3 year time frame hasn't happened yet, but I think it's something that could be on the horizon. And let me say that when it comes to voice interfaces, and especially little kids, in a few years' time, little kids are going to be expecting to talk to almost every kind of device imaginable. And if it doesn't talk back to them, they're going to be very perplexed. Now, when it comes to image recognition, there are so many wonderful applications that AI can be put to, but there's also, like any technology, a little bit of a warning, because all it takes to trick an AI into having it think that something like a bus is an ostrich is to jiggle less than 1% of the pixels in an image. And it can trick an AI into thinking that an image of one thing is actually something else. But to a human looking at that same altered image, the bus still looks like a bus. And that's why we still need humans in the loop. And it's really important that as we start to deploy image recognition, whether it be for images or facial detection, that we still keep humans in the loop to avoid some pretty nefarious mistakes that could happen either on purpose through hacking or even just accidentally. Now, one of the ways that AI might learn is by actually being encapsulated inside of a robot. And really, when we're talking about robots, we're talking about artificial intelligence that is in a physical body, a physical thing. In the picture that I'm showing you here, it's a robot from a company called Kindred AI, and they are actually using people who are in a virtual reality environment and using telepresence to control robots to teach them how to do different things. So, this particular image is a robot that is used in a warehouse. And what the humans are doing is teaching it the difference between how to handle something like a soft cloth and how to handle something like a delicate vase or something made out of glass. There are so many applications that are out there where humans can actually teach robots how to do things. And that's going to be very important to robotic deployment, because right now, a lot of robots are programmed to do specific things. But if you need to reprogram them, then you need very specific robotic expertise. Whereas if you have people that are very skilled at doing particular things and lots of different things, because we humans are multitaskers, then we can start to use people to train robots. And this is another new job of the future that I think is going to be important as we go further and further into the future. Another aspect of AI that is also very important to understand is that AI learns from these big sets of data that we feed it, either through deep learning or machine learning. But we're talking about data sets that have terabytes of data, more information than a human could read in an entire lifetime. So, what can happen when you have that much information going into an AI program is that you could accidentally be putting in human biases into the data set that are not picked up. And then the AI can start to do things that are quite unexpected. An example came out of the Open AI Labs a couple of years ago, where they were teaching an AI how to play a video game that involved boats. It was a coast runner game. and the AI decided to become ultra competitive. So the objective of the game was twofold: one, to cross the finish line, but second, to do it with as many points as possible. And for some reason, the AI decided that getting points was more important than getting across the finish line. And it ended up doing all kinds of crazy things. It would smash into other boats, it would smash into the walls, it would do everything it possibly could to get points through these green widgets that kept popping up out there. And this is where humans once again come into the loop with something that we call reinforcement learning. In other words, putting hooks into the AIs that we're developing so that we can reinforce both good and bad behavior that the AIs that we develop are exhibiting. And I think I forgot to mention this earlier when it came to training robots. That's actually called imitation learning. So basically, the robots are learning how to do things by imitating the actions of humans. And these are two new jobs that really go together, hand in glove. It depends on whether we're talking about software or physical robots, but peppered throughout is this whole bit about ethics and how does an AI or a robot behave in different situations. If we're talking about physical robots, an area where ethics is really important is in driverless cars. Can you imagine what would happen if every driverless car manufacturer had different rules for when it might crash into another vehicle, or who might be harmed, the occupants of a vehicle or the occupants of another vehicle, or whether it would crash into a building, or what kind of behavior it would undertake? So, as we're deploying AI into our companies, we really need to think about all kinds of ethical implications as well. Another thing we need to consider is the human touch, empathy, compassion, and how can we develop AIs that become more human like in the way that they respond to people. And there are a lot of investments happening by big companies that are looking at exactly how can we start to train AIs to take into account empathy. And in fact, companies are employing people like philosophers and poets and playwrights and others that are in the social sciences area to teach AIs how to better get along with humans. A real world example of how this could be useful is in a call center situation. So imagine that you have a call center and the AI starts to pick up that the human on the telephone line talking to an operator is exhibiting signs of distress by picking up the cadence of the words or particular words that they use, or even the tone that they're using, whether it be through a voice interface or a chat-based interface. And it immediately takes that conversation from a general call center operator to people that are specially trained to handle those kinds of situations. That is a really good use of where AI can work really closely with humans to get the best of both worlds. Now, we are unfortunately in the middle of a global pandemic, and it's having a lot of impacts on us. One of them is that we are seeing the acceleration of a lot of smart city trends. One of them is the deployment of the Internet of Things. So these are sensors that are able to detect all kinds of things about our ambient environment, including smart mobility and smart buildings and environment, and also looking at deployment of technologies like 5G, they're being fast tracked because of the things that are happening and the need for connectivity. So much is happening in this world because of the things that are happening to us globally as a human species. One of the things that is a trend that I do not see reversing, but was absolutely accelerated by the pandemic, is working from home. Now, this has been possible for quite a number of years now, but what's happened is that because of the pandemic and lockdowns, we're now in a situation where a lot of people are working from home on a regular basis. And this trend is one that I think is here to stay. And in order to do this properly, we need to make sure that when workers are using equipment from home, that it's work-based equipment rather than personal computers that may be shared by many family members, that they have VPNs deployed, firewalls, all the proper security that you would imagine is needed in a corporate environment, and also that they have the right ergonomics and that they're working comfortably because they're doing so for long periods of time. And that might mean buying people big screens because not only is it more ergonomically sound, people are more productive when they have more screen real estate to use. And it might also mean buying ergonomic chairs, or it could also involve a stipend for people who are using a bit of their home as a dedicated office space and are using more electricity strictly for business purposes. So there is a bit of corporate responsibility that needs to also go into this whole work from home trend. Another thing that is being pushed very rapidly because of world events is moving to onshore manufacturing. And I don't know exactly how it is in Romania, but here in Australia, we've had certain products that have literally been out of stock since the start of COVID. And if this pandemic continues over the course of another year, 2 years, or more, this is not a good situation. And we can use technologies such as 3D printing to be able to start to bring things onshore and do so in an efficient way without having to build huge factories. But not everything can be 3D printed. So there will be traditional factories that may be retooled to be able to start making things onshore. One of the things that's happening here in my part of the world is that an agreement has been struck with a local pharmaceutical company to start manufacturing one of the approved vaccines locally. And that's going to make a difference. And that's an example of something that would be in short supply otherwise, but because of doing things onshore, could help ensure the safety of many millions of people. Another two technologies that I find really interesting are augmented reality and virtual reality. So, with augmented reality, what you're doing is you're still seeing the real world in front of you, but superimposed, maybe through glasses or someday smart contacts, you're seeing extra information. So the picture that I'm showing you here is actually a real world picture from Acciona Agua in Spain, where they are allowing real live workers at their water treatment plant to get feeds from their SCADA system so that they can see in real time what's happening with things like water pressure. And they've got cameras in their glasses. So if they need help from a specialist, they can be able to get that help in real time. That's a really good use of this technology. Another interesting thing that this particular company is doing is using virtual reality as well. And they're using virtual reality for training. So if you can imagine in a place like a water treatment plant, if you're training someone and they turn a real valve in the wrong direction, that can be catastrophic. But if they're doing it in a virtual reality simulation, possibly with multiple coworkers, then that's a safe way of rolling out training that does not have any negative ramifications in the real world. One of the new jobs of the future that we're going to see is an Office of the Future designer, and they're going to be using technologies like augmented and virtual reality. You'll see this is just a picture, it's an illustration, not a real office, but you'll see that it's socially distanced and there's lots of futuristic panels and things that pop up. And this is going to be what may be our offices in just a few short years' time. We're also going to see brand new modes of transportation. And I don't know how many of you have heard of Hyperloops. Most of you probably have, but essentially what they are these big tubes where the air is sucked out so that it's at near vacuum, and then you can hurdle pods of people or cargo through at super fast speeds. You can think of it as the next generation of a really super fast train. An average cruising speed is estimated to be somewhere in the order of 800 kilometers per hour and potentially going up to even 1,300 kilometers an hour. Now, there are a number of companies involved in this. Virgin Hyperloop is one, HTT, Hyperloop Transport Technologies, is another, the Boring Company is another, and I'm sure there are lots more. What's really interesting, though, is that with Virgin Hyperloop in November of 2020, they did a test in their Nevada desert track with two live people going through their test track, their CTO and co founder, and their chief customer experience officer, who happens to be a lady who was born in Romania, of all things. So you've got a Romanian connection there as well. I don't know if Hyperloops are being planned for Romania, but they're definitely being planned for a number of places around the world. Sustainability and taking care of our environment is also very high on the priority list of things that we must do. And anyone who has been watching the news will know that we've seen some really extreme weather conditions in various parts of the world, especially over the last few weeks in the United States, but in many other places too. So already we're looking at renewable energies like solar power and wind power, but we also have technologies like green hydrogen, where literally you're splitting out from H2O, the hydrogen and the water, and you're doing it in an environmentally safe way. And there are lots of other new green technologies that are on the horizon that many of you may not have heard of, but could prove to be really great investments. One of them is called blue energy. And literally, it is using the kinetic energy of having salt water and fresh water when they meet each other, and then capturing this kinetic energy in these little tiny nanoporous membranes, and then storing it in hydroelectric plants. And I was looking last night at Romania, noticed that it was situated on the Black Sea, did a little bit more investigation and saw that the Black Sea does have salt water, but not as salty as an ocean, but the very lower layers do have more salt than the top layers. I'm not sure, because of lack of time to investigate, whether this is a technology that you can use in Romania, but literally any country that is sitting on the coast of an ocean and has a freshwater body going into it will be able to take advantage of this energy And the only refuse is brackish water. That means salty water, and then you can use it for all sorts of energy, and it's not dependent on the weather, which is one of the problems with solar and wind. So, going into the future, are we going to take tech into our bodies? Will we become cyborgs? Well, it'll probably start with something like smart contacts, which will combine all the things that we use in our smartphones today, along with augmented reality and biotech. Can you imagine having contacts that will be able to sense medical conditions in your body based on the chemicals in your tear ducts and be able to download all kinds of apps to go into your smart contacts? That's on the horizon, and there are a lot of companies working on this from both the ICT side and the pharmaceutical side. But it gets even more weird and wonderful when we start thinking about brain implants. Can you imagine sticking a chip inside of your head? And that chip is an AI chip. Do we actually want to merge ourselves with an AI and merge with a machine? That's a question that's probably, for most people, 10 years off, but it actually has been researched for at least a decade for many, many different medical applications. One of the early applications that researchers were looking at were memory diseases like Alzheimer's and dementia, and trying to find ways of being able to store people's memories so that they could readily access them. Then it started to move into areas of, well, if someone has been paralyzed in an accident, what if we had an AI chip that enabled them to be able to regain movement of limbs that otherwise they would not be able to control, or other body organs? Perhaps one of the most famous companies that you would have heard of in this area is Neuralink, which was founded by Elon Musk. And he initially came up with this idea because he wanted to stave off the robots from taking over, but then quickly moved into the medical applications of looking at spinal cord paralysis, but has more recently been also looking at applications such as being able to control people's emotions and stress levels for things like post traumatic stress disorder and others, and also allowing people to have better than normal hearing by giving them the ability to hear frequencies that people wouldn't normally have heard of. And in November, he announced some trials with different animals. And just recently, a few weeks ago, in early February, was talking about monkeys being able to play video games by using the chips that were in their brains. Well, guess what? A couple of years ago at the Consumer Electronics Show, I actually was able to control a video game with my thoughts, with no implant in my head, but there was actually a pillow on back of me that was able to be sensitive enough to pick up my brain waves and allow me to control a road racing video game. And I got to be pretty good at it. So maybe we don't actually need to have these chips in our heads to do that. But if we do take AI into our minds, what are the possible ramifications and what could go wrong? Because with any technology, you can use it for good and bad purposes, and you can also have unintended consequences. And one of the things that I think about as a futurist is, well, if I've got a chip in my brain and it's wanting to take action based on my thoughts, what if I have a fleeting thought that I have absolutely no intention whatsoever of actually executing, but it is not able to discern the difference between a fleeting thought and an actual intent? So a real concrete example might be I'm driving in traffic and somebody cuts me off and I have this fleeting thought of, oh, somebody should hit such and such in the rear end of their car, teach them a lesson for cutting people off so quickly. But I would never actually do something like that. But for a split second when I'm really scared and my adrenaline's going, I might think it. But what if that AI chip actually acted on it? Another thing to consider is that today's legal environment is very much based on humans making decisions. Now, if you've got an AI chip in your head, who's actually making the decision? Is it the human or is it the AI chip? There are going to be a lot of ramifications to this technology. So for right now, I'm a big fan of using it for medical purposes to help people with diseases, but I am very cautious when it comes to using it for other things until we get a much better handle on what the ramifications might be. And that really goes to ethics. And I think that in many companies around the world, we're going to see another CEO, the chief ethics officer, and that will deal with a lot of different things, including how AI is deployed within a company, what kinds of databases are being used, and how these different technologies are being deployed, and how workers in the company are being treated as a result of taking in either AI-based software or even physical robots. Another new job of the future that I think is going to be increasingly important is a privacy guardian. And we've all seen massive privacy breaches, intentional or unintentional. It happens. And one of the things I would say is think about the data that you're collecting about your customers and ask yourselves, do I really need to hold that data about my customer, or is it just something I'd like to know? And what are the ramifications, especially in Romania, which is part of the EU, under GDPR, General Data Protection Regulations, if you were to have a privacy breach? So I think that there will be people who act either on behalf of companies or individuals that look after this, and it's going to be a big job of the future. So going into the future, what might we expect in terms of healthcare and longevity? There are some really exciting things happening here. Stem cells, this is coming from our own body, have potential to allow us to regain health. And there are experiments that are already happening where stem cells are harvested from our own bodies. And not only are we growing replacement skin that is completely biocompatible, but there is a scientist in Israel that has grown a miniature human heart. It's probably about 10 years before this becomes mainstream. But imagine if you need an organ transplant and instead of having to wait for a donor, you literally grow it right from your own body and it fits perfectly and there's no autoimmune rejection and you never have to take drugs to prevent it. Genetic engineering is another one that is just amazing and so much research happening in this area. We've mapped out the human genome, but we don't know exactly what all of them can do. But there are researchers who are predicting that somewhere in the next 10, 15, 20 years, we're going to be able to find the switch that controls aging. And if and when we do, we might live to be 400 years old or even 800 years old and maybe even beyond. Imagine the implications for society. Imagine working for 400 years. Imagine being married to the same person for 800 years. What do you think the implications would be for population on this planet, for property inheritance, and for so much more? And then there's nanobots. These are teeny, weeny, weeny little robots that could live inside of our bodies and literally, because they're microscopic in size, detect diseases before they take hold. If we had nanobots in our body right now, coronavirus wouldn't stand a chance because these little robots would be smaller than coronavirus. There have been researchers around the world that have been working on nanobots for many years right now. And I was recently listening to a podcast where some Japanese researchers were speculating about the use of nanobots to fight COVID as well. And I think that this could become a reality. But once again, what happens if we have these things inside our body and somebody else takes control of them? We need to, again, think about the ethical implications of who might own these gadgets that are inside of our own bodies. The human touch, I think, is always going to be important. And it's something that a lot of us have been missing during this crisis. Where I get really excited, though, is outer space, the final frontier. And as a human race, we are on the cusp of really going into outer space because of the development by private industry of reusable rockets. It's a reality now, it's happening. And that means that we might become a multiplanetary civilization in the near term. Maybe not us, but our kids and our grandkids might be real-time space explorers. And what bodes really well for this is the discovery of water on planetary bodies in our solar system. So the picture on the left shows an artist's depiction of what Mars might have looked like a few billion years ago as a watery planet. On the right, it's showing areas where water has been detected beneath the surface, but really interestingly, in the inset, which is the Hale crater, they've detected signs of sporadic running water from time to time, which is super exciting. And recently, NASA's SoFIA mission has discovered water on the sunlit side of the moon, where it was thought that no water previously existed. They're not sure yet whether it is sitting under the surface, whether it might have been deposited by meteorites, or even whether it might have come from some energetic particles from our sun. But this bodes really well for us colonizing other planets. Along with this, we're going to see AI and robots as our companions in being able to get into outer space, because they can go to places that are dangerous for us humans. They can do the pre-exploration in places that might have too much radiation for a human to do the first exploration, or they might be out there building the habitats for us in safe places. They might be mining asteroids or even controlling drones and spaceships. Endless limits of jobs that will be in the outer space sector. And someday we might be living in habitats that look like this. Now, this is an artist's depiction, but it may be that these habitats are actually 3D printed using materials that are already present on exoplanets. And by the way, scientists have already confirmed over 4,000 exoplanets just in our one galaxy. And they estimate that in just our one galaxy, which is out of many billions, maybe trillions, there are 300 million exoplanets that may be human habitable. Oh my gosh, talk about the future of humanity. Space tourism, somewhere in the future, it might be 40 years out or even 50 years out, maybe the next big thing. And I'd like to thank you for your time this afternoon. And it has been my great pleasure speaking with you. I'd like to leave you with just a closing thought about AI and skills and people. And it's just so important, I think, that we understand the technologies that are on the horizon, that we understand the kinds of new jobs of the future that are possible, that we look at the people in our organization in conjunction with them, and look at the stuff that's boring and repetitive and let your people tell you the stuff that they don't like doing. And that's where automation can play a role. And if you take the time to do a personality analysis and skill set inventory and then start reskilling people, well, then you've got the best of both worlds with using technology and people. And I have to say, I'm very pleased to say that in my discussions with Microsoft, I know that they have a program that is very much involved in reskilling people for this new age of technology. Thank you once again. It has been my absolute delight being with you today.